On the 7th of September, 1937, a handful of servants stood in the fading light and watched their home burn. The fire pump would not start. It had not worked in years, maybe decades, and nobody had bothered to check. By morning, one of the largest private palaces in Europe was a smoking shell. But here is what makes Witley Court's story so much stranger than a house fire. The mansion had already been dying for 40 years before the flames ever touched it. The real destruction began not with a spark in a basement bakery, but with a drowning off the coast of Ireland, a gambling habit, and 665 enslaved people in Jamaica. This is the story of a house that took 4 centuries to build and less than 1 night to gut. But the fire was not the cause of death. It was the coroner's report. The real killing had been done slowly, quietly, by the same economic machinery that raised these walls in the first place. To understand why Witley Court burned, we have to go back to a workshop in Dudley, where a man was hammering nails. Chapter 1. The nailmaker's grandson buys a manor. The fortune that built Witley Court began with a man who hammered nails for a living in a Dudley workshop. His name was Richard Foley. He was born around 1580 in the Black Country, that dense knot of coal seams and iron deposits in the English Midlands, where the air tasted of soot and the rivers ran orange. The nail trade was brutal, low-margin work. A man could spend 12 hours at a forge and earn barely enough to feed a family. But Richard Foley was not interested in making nails forever. He was interested in how nails were made. The story that has come down through the centuries, likely embellished but persistent, is that Foley traveled to Sweden disguised as a fiddler. He wanted to learn the secret of splitting iron rods into nail rods using a slitting mill. Sweden had the technology. England did not. Whether the fiddler story is true or not, Foley returned to Stourbridge and built one of England's first slitting mills around 1627. The machine changed everything. It turned iron bars into thin rods at a speed no hand process could match. It was the kind of innovation that does not make headlines. It simply makes money. Lots of it. Within a generation, the Foleys controlled a network of ironworks, forges, and furnaces across Worcestershire and beyond. They supplied the raw materials of an expanding economy: nails, tools, fittings. And when the English Civil War tore the country apart in the 1640s, they supplied something far more profitable: cannons. The war was a catastrophe for England. It was a windfall for iron makers. Parliament needed weapons. The Foleys were ready to provide them. By the time the fighting ended and Charles I lost his head in 1649, the family had accumulated wealth that no nailmaker could have imagined. Now came the transformation that every newly rich English family attempted. The Foleys needed to stop looking like ironmongers and start looking like gentlemen. That meant land. Land meant status. Status meant survival. The estate they chose was Witley Court. It was not yet a grand house. When the Russell family built it around 1624, Witley was a modest Jacobean manor. Red brick, engabled roofs, mullioned windows. Handsome enough for a country gentleman, but nothing that would turn heads. It sat in rolling Worcestershire countryside, surrounded by farmland and forest, about 10 miles northwest of Worcester. A quiet place, a respectable place. Thomas Foley, Richard's grandson, bought the estate in 1655 for a sum that does not survive in the records. What does survive is the logic of the purchase. Thomas was not buying a house. He was buying a disguise. The Jacobean brick would cover the smell of the forge. The parkland would erase the memory of the workshop. Within a generation, the Foleys would be not iron makers, but landowners, not manufacturers, but gentlemen. This was the essential alchemy of the English class system. Raw money, made in smoke and fire and war, and was poured into soil and stone until it looked old, until it looked permanent, until nobody remembered where it came from. The Foleys were not unique in this. Across England, merchant families were buying their way into the landed gentry. What made the Foleys remarkable was the scale of their ambition and the speed of their ascent. Thomas Foley entered Parliament. His sons consolidated. His grandsons expanded. Within 3 generations of the nail workshop, the family held estates across 3 counties, and the old brick manor at Witley was already being altered, enlarged, and reimagined. But the iron money that bought Witley had a habit built into it. Every generation felt the need to prove itself again, to build bigger, to spend more, to cover what came before with something grander. The Jacobean manor was never enough. It was always just the starting point. And for 182 years, a family that never even bothered to change its first name kept tearing the house apart and putting it back together. Chapter 2. 8 generations, all named Thomas. For 182 years, a family that never changed its first name kept rebuilding the same house. The Foleys held Witley Court from 1655 to 1837. In that time, 8 successive heads of the family, nearly all of them called Thomas, treated the estate not as a home, but as a project that could never be finished. Each generation inherited the last one's work, judged it insufficient, and started again. The first Thomas added wings. His son added more. The proportions of the original Jacobean house were stretched, extended, wrapped in new facades. By the early 1700s, Witley was no longer a modest manor. It was becoming something closer to a statement. But the most extraordinary addition had nothing to do with the house itself. It was the church. Great Witley Church, dedicated to St. Michael, stands just yards from the house. The Foleys rebuilt it in the 1730s and filled it with one of the most remarkable interiors in England. The ceiling paintings and the painted glass windows were not made for Witley. They were made for the chapel at Cannons, the Duke of Chandos's extravagant mansion in Middlesex. When Cannons was demolished in 1747, its contents were scattered at auction. The Foleys bought the paintings, the glass, and the gilded papier-mâché ceiling decorations and had them shipped by canal and cart to Worcestershire. Think about that for a moment. A family of ironmakers, barely a century removed from the forge, bought the spiritual furnishings of a duke's private chapel and installed them in their own parish church. The ceiling is by Antonio Bellucci. The windows are attributed to Joshua Price after designs by Francesco Sleater. They glow with amber and gold light that makes the interior feel more like a Roman basilica than an English country church. The church was a declaration. It said, "We are not new money. We have the taste of dukes. We belong here. But belonging costs money." And by the late 1700s, the Foley fortune was under strain. The ironworks that had funded everything were facing competition. New families with new technologies were entering the market. And the second Baron Foley, who inherited in 1766, he had a problem that no amount of iron could solve. He gambled. The details are not fully documented, but the pattern is clear enough. The second Baron's debts mounted through the 1770s and 1780s. He sold land. He mortgaged property. He lived beyond what even a substantial industrial income could support. The estate survived him, but it survived diminished. The margin for error had narrowed. It was during this period that the family made one last grand architectural gesture. They hired John Nash. Nash was not yet the man who would redesign Buckingham Palace and lay out Regent Street. In the 1780s, he was a talented but not yet famous architect working in the Welsh Marches. The Foleys commissioned him to add a portico to Witley Court's south front. What he built was enormous, a full classical portico with massive columns, the largest on any private house in England. It turned the entrance into something that looked like a temple front. It was magnificent. It was also an act of defiance. The family was spending money it could barely afford on a facade that proclaimed stability and power. Behind the portico, the debts quietly grew. By the 1820s, the Foley line was exhausted in every sense. The money was thin. The direct mail line was failing. The estate needed a new owner with a new fortune, and as if on cue, one appeared. He was 16 years old. His name was William Ward, and his trustees had just agreed to spend £680,000 on a house for a boy who could not yet sign his own checks. Chapter 3. £680,000 for a boy who cannot spend it. In 1837, trustees spent a sum equivalent to nearly £100 million today on a house for a teenager who was not yet allowed to touch his own money. William Ward was born in 1817 into the kind of fortune that makes even other rich people uncomfortable. His father, the first Viscount Dudley and Ward, controlled the most productive coal field in England. The family's mines around Dudley produced close to 1 million tons of coal per year. Their ironworks turned that coal into products that fed the Industrial Revolution. Annual income from the Ward estates exceeded £100,000 at a time when a skilled laborer might earn £50 in a year. But the Ward fortune was not built on coal alone. In Jamaica, the family owned plantations worked by enslaved people. The records of the Slave Compensation Commission, open to researchers in the early 2000s, show that the Ward estates claimed compensation for 665 enslaved individuals when slavery was abolished in the British Empire in 1833. The family received thousands of pounds in compensation, not for the people they had enslaved, but for the loss of their property. This is the part of Witley Court's story that the guidebooks have only recently begun to tell. The fountains, the gilded rooms, the immaculate gardens, all of it was funded in part by a system that treated human beings as assets on a balance sheet. The coal money was enormous, but it was the combination of coal, iron, and slavery that created the scale of wealth that could buy a palace and then spend decades making it bigger. When William's father died in 1833, the boy was just 16. His inheritance was placed in the hands of trustees who managed the estates with a combination of caution and ambition. They looked at Witley Court, recently on the market as the Foley line collapsed, and they saw potential. The house was large. The grounds were extensive. The location was convenient to the family's Midlands industrial base. The purchase price of £680,000 was staggering. Adjusted for inflation, it approaches $100 million in today's money. The trustees were not simply buying a house. They were buying the apparatus of aristocratic life. The farms, the tenancies, the shooting rights, the village, the church. Everything that a great English landlord was supposed to possess. But the boy who nominally owned all of this was not yet old enough to make decisions about it. William Ward grew up in the strange limbo of the very wealthy miner. The house was his, but he could not alter it. The money was his, but he could not spend it. He waited, and while he waited, someone else moved in. Queen Adelaide, widow of King William IV, leased Witley Court as her country residence from 1843. For several years, a dowager queen occupied the house that a teenage Cole heir technically owned. She made improvements. She planted trees. She treated the place as though it were hers. When William finally came of age and took full possession of his fortune, he had a house that a queen had lived in, an income that rivaled most dukes, and the social ambition to match. He was created Baron Ward in 1860 and eventually Earl of Dudley in 1860. Everything was in place. The money was vast. The house was waiting. The ambition was limitless. All that remained was a reason to build. And then, 7 months after his wedding, his wife died. Chapter 4. A widower rebuilds the world in stone. 7 months after his wedding, William Ward buried his wife and their stillborn child, then tore his house apart. Selina Ward, born Selina de Burgh, died in 1851. She was 23. The child she carried died with her. William was 34, and by every account, the loss broke something in him. He would not remarry for another 14 years. In the meantime, he redirected the full force of his grief, his money, and his restless energy into the only thing that could absorb it all. He rebuilt Witley Court. The architect he chose was Samuel Dawkes, a competent, if not celebrated designer who had worked on churches and institutional buildings. Dawkes was not a visionary in the mold of Nash or Barry. He was something more useful to a grieving billionaire. He was obedient. He would build whatever his patron demanded, at whatever scale his patron could afford. And William Ward could afford anything. The transformation began in 1855 and continued until roughly 1860. It was not a renovation, it was a replacement. Dawkes wrapped the entire Jacobean and Georgian house in a new skin of Bathstone. The warm, honey-colored limestone that gives the city of Bath its elegance was shipped to Worcestershire and laid over the old red brick like a mask. Where the Foleys had built in the local style, Ward imposed the Italianate palace vocabulary. Giant pilasters, balustrades, ornamental urns. The house grew to over 100 rooms. Inside, the transformation was equally total. Ward gutted the existing interiors and refurnished them in the style of Louis XV. This was not the taste of an Englishman decorating an English house. It was the taste of a man who wanted to live inside Versailles. Gilded plasterwork covered the ceilings. Silk lined the walls. Marble fireplaces were imported from France and Italy. Each room was a set piece, designed not for comfort, but for impact. The staterooms alone consumed fortunes. The ballroom could hold 300 dancers beneath 8 vast chandeliers. The dining room seated 60. Drawing rooms, music rooms, morning rooms, smoking rooms, a billiard room, a library, each one furnished as though it were the only room in the house. The cumulative effect was one of staggering, almost aggressive opulence. But the interior was merely the overture. The real spectacle was outside. William Nesfield, one of the greatest garden designers of the Victorian age, was commissioned to create the grounds. His masterpiece at Witley was the Perseus and Andromeda fountain. It remains one of the largest sculptural fountains ever built in Britain. 20 tons of Portland stone and bronze, carved by James Forsyth, depicting Perseus rescuing Andromeda from the sea monster. When the fountain operated at full power, its central jet reached 120 feet. Side jets threw water in arcs that caught the light and turned the south parterre into something closer to a water theater than a garden. and Nesfield himself called it his monster work. The total cost of the gardens and grounds has been estimated at £250,000, an amount that could have built a small town. The orangery, attached to the south side of the house, was modeled on Joseph Paxton's Crystal Palace. A soaring structure of glass and iron, it housed tropical plants and served as a winter garden where guests could stroll among palms and ferns while snow fell outside. It was engineering and fantasy combined, a greenhouse the size of a railway station. The operational scale of the rebuilt Witley Court was industrial. Heating the house required 30 tons of coal per day during winter months. The kitchen served meals for a household of up to 100 servants. 25 gamekeepers managed the shooting estates. The gardens employed dozens of laborers to maintain what Nesfield had designed and what Ward demanded. Consider what this means in practical terms. Witley Court consumed coal at a rate that would have heated several hundred ordinary homes. Its servant population exceeded many English villages. Its annual running costs, estimated at tens of thousands of pounds per year, equaled the total income of a prosperous factory. The house did not simply sit in the landscape, it devoured resources from it. And this was the point. Ward was not building a home, he was building a monument. To what exactly? To his dead wife? To his own status? To the sheer fact that he could, is impossible to say. Grief does not explain architecture on this scale. Neither does vanity alone. What explains it is the logic of the system Ward inhabited. A man with the largest private income in England was expected to spend it visibly, to build, to display, to perform wealth in stone and water and gold. The performance was magnificent, but it had a flaw built into its foundations. The money that paid for all of it came from mines that would not produce forever, from an industrial base that was already facing competition, and from an imperial economy that was beginning to contract. William Ward had built a house that required one of the largest fortunes in England to sustain. The question was never whether the fortune would last. The question was how long the house could survive once it started to shrink. Chapter 5. The Party Palace at Full Power. Twice a week, gardeners replanted entire flower beds between dinner courses so that guests would see a different garden by dessert. This was not an unusual expenditure at Witley Court during its golden years. It was simply how things were done. The second Earl of Dudley, William Humble Ward, inherited the estate in 1885 and married Rachel Gurney in 1891. Rachel was the daughter of a Norfolk banking family. She was beautiful, socially ambitious, and perfectly suited to the role of hostess at one of England's grandest houses. Together, they turned Witley Court into a performance space for the Edwardian elite. The guest lists read like a directory of power. The Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, visited regularly for shooting parties. The Duke and Duchess of Westminster, Lord and Lady Curzon, politicians, generals, financiers. To be invited to Witley was to confirm your place in the uppermost tier of English society. To host such people was to confirm yours. The scale of hospitality was extraordinary. Formal dinners served 200. Outdoor lunches accommodated up to 900. Garden parties offered tea to 850. At Christmas, the Great Hall held a tree draped not with tinsel, but with real jewelry, gifts for the guests. Shooting parties consumed thousands of birds raised specifically to be killed. The wine cellars held vintages selected by experts. The kitchens operated on a factory schedule. Behind all of this, invisible by design, worked the servant army that made the illusion possible. Witley Court employed approximately 100 indoor and outdoor servants during the ward era. The hierarchy was precise. The butler managed the footmen. The housekeeper managed the maids. The cook presided over the kitchen staff. Valets attended individual male guests. Ladies' maids attended the women. Outside, the gamekeepers, gardeners, grooms, and estate workers formed a parallel workforce. The architecture itself was designed to keep this workforce hidden. Service corridors ran behind the main rooms so that a maid carrying a coal scuttle would never cross the path of a guest walking to breakfast. Back staircases connected the basement kitchens to the upper floors without passing through any public space. The servants' entrance was located so that delivery carts and tradespeople approached from a direction no guest would ever see. This was the central trick of the English country house. It presented a world of effortless elegance, of flowers that seemed to arrange themselves, meals that appeared from nowhere, rooms that warmed without visible effort. The effort was enormous. It was simply made invisible. A single dinner party at Witley required days of preparation. Silver had to be polished. Linen had to be pressed. Flowers had to be arranged. Menus had to be planned, ingredients sourced, wines selected. The table itself was a production, with crystal, china, and silver laid according to precise rules of spacing and arrangement. Each course demanded separate kitchen operations running simultaneously. Each guest required a bedroom prepared to their specific preferences, with fires lit, water heated, towels laid out, and nightclothes pressed. Multiply this by 200 guests, then multiply it by a weekend, then multiply it by the shooting season, the racing season, the Christmas season. The labor never stopped. The cost of a single weekend party at a house of Witley's scale has been estimated at the equivalent of several £1,000s, in an era when a housemaid earned perhaps £20 a year. The annual wage bill for the servant staff alone ran to thousands. Add food, wine, game management, garden maintenance, heating, lighting, repairs, insurance, and the running cost of Witley Court during its golden era approached the annual budget of a small municipality. Rachel Ward managed this enterprise with skill and apparent ease. She was known for her charm, her beauty, and her ability to make even the grandest occasions feel natural. Photographs from the period show a woman of poise and confidence, dark-haired and direct-eyed, standing in gardens that looked like paintings. But the gardens that looked like paintings required an army to maintain. The formal parterres designed by Nesfield demanded constant attention. Hedges were trimmed to mathematical precision. Gravel paths were raked daily. The flower beds that changed between dinner courses required not just gardeners, but advanced planning, reserve plantings, and a greenhouse operation capable of producing mature plants on a schedule. The fountain, Perseus rising from the spray, ran on a system that consumed thousands of gallons of water per hour. It was the centerpiece of every garden party, every tour, every afternoon walk. Its operation was a minor engineering feat involving boilers, pumps, and a dedicated team of operators. All of this, the parties, the gardens, the servants, the fountains, depended on one thing: money. A money in quantities that only a major industrial fortune could supply. And during the 1890s, the money was still flowing. Coal was still king. The mines around Dudley were still producing. The income, though no longer growing as fast as it once had, was still vast. But even at the height of the spectacle, the numbers were beginning to tell a different story. And the chandeliers, blazing in the ballroom while 300 guests danced beneath them, were burning through a fortune that would not last another generation. Chapter 6. The fortune that was already leaving. By the time the chandeliers were blazing brightest, the coal mines that paid for them were losing money to Germany and America. This is the chapter of the story that nobody at Witley Court wanted to hear. Not the Earl, not the Countess, not the guests who arrived in motor cars and left weighed down with jewelry from the Christmas tree. The money was still arriving, but it was arriving slower. And the reasons were structural. They were built into the global economy. No amount of entertaining could change them. British industrial supremacy peaked around 1870 and began a long, irreversible decline. The causes fill volumes of economic history, but the essence is simple. Germany industrialized aggressively. America industrialized on a continental scale. Both had newer equipment, lower labor costs, and access to raw materials that matched or exceeded Britain's. The Black Country Iron Works that had funded the Foley fortune and then the Ward fortune faced competition they could not overcome by simply working harder. Coal prices fluctuated. Export markets shrank. The American steel industry, powered by the Bessemer process and vast domestic iron ore reserves, undercut British producers. German chemical industries created new materials that replaced traditional iron products. The mines around Dudley did not close overnight. They simply became less profitable year by year, decade by decade. The second Earl of Dudley responded in the only way the system allowed. He sold things. Between the 1890s and the 1910s, the Ward family divested vast holdings. Estates in Scotland were sold. Properties in Wales went to market. The Jamaican plantations, long since converted from slave labor to wage labor, but still part of the family portfolio, were disposed of. Each sale bought time. Each sale shrank the foundation on which Witley Court stood. The numbers tell the story with cold precision. The Ward income, which had exceeded £100,000 per year at its peak, began to contract. Estate expenses did not contract with it. Witley Court still required its army of servants, its tons of coal, its constant maintenance. The gap between income and expenditure narrowed, then reversed. And then the Earl's personal life delivered another blow. In 1912, William and Rachel Ward separated. The reasons were private, but the consequences were financial. Two households now operated where one had existed before. Rachel moved to London. The Earl remained at Witley, but the social engine that Rachel had powered, the parties, the guest lists, the carefully managed hospitality, ground to a halt. Without Rachel, the house lost its function as a social theater. It became merely expensive. Then came the war. In August 1914, the world that had produced Witley Court's golden era was destroyed. The First World War killed a generation of the young men who had danced in the ballroom and shot in the coverts. The servant class that had made the house function was pulled into factories, uniforms, and graves. Domestic service, which had employed more British women than any other occupation before the war, began its permanent decline. Young men who had worked as footmen and grooms discovered that factory wages and army pay exceeded what even a great house could offer. They did not come back. The Wards lost 2 sons in the fighting. The personal devastation mirrored the systemic collapse. By the end of the war, in 1918, the world that Witley Court was built to serve no longer existed. The aristocratic social circuit that justified a 100-room palace was shattered. The industrial base that funded it was contracting. The servant economy that operated it was dissolving. The tax system that had tolerated vast landed wealth was being reformed to pay for the war's costs. Between 1875 and 1975, approximately 1,200 English country houses were demolished. Not burned, not bombed, but deliberately torn down because their owners could no longer afford to maintain them. Witley Court was not yet among them, but the forces that would destroy it were already at work. The second Earl continued to live at Witley through the 19-teens, but the house was increasingly a shell of its former self. Rooms were closed. Staff were reduced. The gardens received less attention. The fountain ran less often. The gap between what Witley Court demanded and what the ward fortune could provide grew wider every year. The system that had built this place, colonial wealth, industrial monopoly, cheap labor, aristocratic display, was the same system whose decline was now undermining it. Witley Court had been built by a rising tide. The tide was going out, and it would take only one more shock to start the final collapse. That shock came on a June afternoon in 1920 off the coast of Ireland. Chapter 7. A drowning in Ireland changes everything. On the 26th of June, 1920, Rachel Ward went swimming in the sea off Connemara and never came back. She was 52 years old. She had been living in Ireland since her separation from the Earl, moving among friends in the Anglo-Irish gentry, enjoying the Atlantic coast. The details of her death are sparse. She went into the water. The currents off the west coast of Ireland are notoriously dangerous, cold, and unpredictable, even in summer. Her body was recovered. The coroner's verdict was drowning. Rachel's death might seem like a personal tragedy, unrelated to the fate of a Worcestershire mansion. It was not. It was the trigger. The second Earl of Dudley had never recovered from the separation. Whether he still loved Rachel or simply could not face the associations that Witley Court held without her, the effect was the same. Within months of her death, he made the decision to sell. The sale of Witley Court in 1920 was not a private transaction between gentlemen. It was a liquidation. The estate, which had once encompassed several thousand acres, was broken into hundreds of lots and auctioned. Farms, cottages, woodland, fields. The landscape that the Foleys had assembled and the wards had enlarged was carved apart and sold to whoever would pay. The house itself went to Sir Herbert Smith. Smith was a Kidderminster carpet manufacturer. He had made his money in exactly the kind of middle-class industry that the aristocracy had always looked down upon. His nickname, widely used behind his back, was Piggy. He paid a fraction of what the wards had spent on the estate, a sum variously reported, but certainly far below the £680,000 the trustees had paid 83 years earlier. The sale marked the end of the aristocratic chapter. For 265 years, Witley Court had been owned by families who understood, or at least attempted, the demands of a great estate. The Foleys had been ironmakers playing at being gentry. The Wards had been coal magnates performing as aristocrats. Both had spent lavishly. But they had spent within a system that, for all its flaws, maintained the house as a functioning entity. Smith was different. He was not buying a way of life. He was buying a house. And the house he bought was designed for a way of life that no longer existed. Consider the mathematics. Witley Court had required 100 servants to operate at full capacity. The income to support that staff had come from coal mines, iron works, and agricultural rents spanning thousands of acres. Smith had a carpet factory. He was wealthy by any ordinary measure. But Witley Court did not operate on an ordinary measure. The moment the auction hammer fell, the countdown began, not to the fire. The fire was still 17 years away. The countdown was to the point where the gap between what the house needed and what its owner could provide became unbridgeable. Everything that happened next was mathematics, and the mathematics were merciless. Chapter 8: The Man Who Lived in One Corner of a Palace. Sir Herbert Smith kept 6 maids and a butler in a house that had needed 100 servants to function. The image is worth holding in your mind. 100 rooms, 6 maids, a butler, a cook, perhaps a gardener or 2. The ratios are absurd. It would be like trying to maintain a hospital with a single nurse. The building did not care about Smith's budget. It had its own requirements. Stone needs pointing, lead needs inspection, timber needs ventilation, plumbing needs maintenance, and a building the size of Witley Court had miles of plumbing, acres of roofing, and more windows than a small town. Smith's solution was retreat. He and his family occupied the southwest corner of the house. The rest was closed. Room by room, corridor by corridor, the palace shut down. Doors were locked. Dust sheets were laid over furniture. Shutters were drawn. The grand rooms that had hosted princes and held 300 dancers fell into silence. Outside, the decline was equally visible. The Perseus fountain, which had once thrown water 120 feet into the air, went quiet. The boilers that powered it were expensive to run, and the pumps required engineers to operate. Smith could not justify the cost. The parterre gardens, which had demanded daily raking and seasonal replanting, grew rough. The hedges that Nesfield had trimmed to geometric perfection lost their shapes. Paths disappeared under weeds. The orangery, that Crystal Palace in miniature, began to deteriorate. Glass cracked. Iron frames rusted. The tropical plants that had amazed Edwardian guests died or were removed. Without constant heating and attention, a glass structure of that size simply cannot survive an English winter. Each year took more pains. Each year reduced the structure further. Smith did make some improvements. He installed electric lighting, replacing the gas mantles and oil lamps that had illuminated the house. This was a practical decision. Electricity was cheaper and safer than maintaining the old systems. But it was also a token gesture, like putting new curtains in the window of a house whose foundations are cracking. The critical failure was insurance. Witley Court was effectively uninsurable at full replacement value. The premiums for a building of that size, constructed largely of timber and stone with extensive wooden roofing, would have been enormous. Smith insured the house, but for a fraction of its true value. The policy would cover perhaps a quarter of any major damage. And then there was the fire pump. Every large country house in England maintained its own firefighting equipment. In the days before rural fire brigades could respond quickly, the estate's own pump was the first and sometimes only line of defense. Witley Court had a fire pump. It had been installed decades earlier, during the Ward era, when the house had engineers and maintenance staff who could keep it working. Under Smith's reduced household, the pump sat untested. No one checked its valves. No one primed its engine. No one ran a drill to confirm it worked. Year after year, the pump rusted in its housing. And year after year, Witley Court's timber roof dried a little more. Its maintenance fell a little further behind. Its vulnerability grew a little greater. Smith was not a negligent man by ordinary standards. He was simply an ordinary man in an extraordinary situation. He had bought a palace designed for an industrial magnate and tried to run it on a carpet manufacturer's budget. The result was predictable. The house was too big for him. Its needs were too great. Its demands were too relentless. By the mid-1930s, Witley Court was a building in name only. Its function had ceased. Its infrastructure was failing. Its owner was overwhelmed. All it needed was a spark. Chapter 9: The Night the Fire Pump Would Not Start. The fire began in the basement bakery at 8 o'clock on a windy September evening, and there was almost no one home to fight it. The 7th of September, 1937, was a Tuesday. Sir Herbert Smith was away. The skeleton staff, the handful of maids and the butler who maintained their corner of the vast house, discovered the fire in the basement bakery. The exact cause was never definitively established. An overheated flue. A fault in the brickwork around the ovens. It hardly matters. What matters is what happened next. They tried the fire pump. It would not start. The pump had not been tested in years, perhaps decades. The seals had perished. The mechanism had seized. The device that represented the house's only immediate defense against fire was a piece of rusted machinery. It might as well have been a statue. The staff did what they could. They formed bucket chains. They closed doors to slow the spread. But a fire in a house the size of Witley Court, fed by decades of dry timber, old fabric, and wooden floors, moves faster than a handful of people with buckets can contain. The September wind pushed the flames through the east wing. They found the service corridors, the hidden passages that had once kept the servants invisible, and raced through them like highways. The local fire brigade was called. Then brigades from neighboring towns. By the time the firefighters arrived, and the central and eastern sections were fully involved, nearly 100 firemen fought the blaze through the night, but the building's sheer scale defeated them. There was not enough water pressure. There were not enough hoses. The building's layout, with its interconnected rooms and long corridors, created draft channels that fed the flames with oxygen. By morning, the house was a shell. The south front still stood, its bathstone facade blackened but intact. Nash's great portico survived. Some of the western rooms were salvageable, but the core of the house, the staterooms, the ballroom, the grand staircase, the gilded interiors that William Ward had spent years creating, was gone. The fire destroyed roughly 2/3 of the interior. Ceilings had collapsed. Floors had burned through. The roof was gone over most of the building. What remained was a stone box open to the sky, its interior reduced to ash and rubble. And now the economics delivered their final verdict. Smith's insurance covered approximately a quarter of the damage. Rebuilding was out of the question. The cost would have been enormous, and for what? To rebuild a house that had been too expensive to maintain even before the fire? The logic was inescapable. Witley Court, as a functioning building, was finished. Smith tried to sell, but the timing was catastrophic. Europe was sliding toward war. The British economy was strained. The market for fire-damaged country houses, which was never robust, was now essentially non-existent. An auction was held in 1938. The contents that survived the fire were sold. Furniture, paintings, silver, everything that could be removed and priced. The estate itself was broken up further. The prices achieved were pitiful, fractions of what the items had cost. The fire of 1937 did not kill Witley Court. It merely confirmed a death that had been decades in the making. The fire pump that failed was the perfect emblem. Not a sudden catastrophe, but the end point of a long, slow withdrawal of care, money, and purpose. Every year that the pump went untested, every season that the roof went unrepaired, Every decade that the income shrank while the building's demand stayed constant had led to this moment. The fire was not an accident. It was an inevitability that happened to arrive on a specific date. Chapter 10. The Scrap Dealers, the Holiday Camp, and the Pop Song. After the fire came something worse. 40 years of people pulling Witley Court apart piece by piece. If the fire was the death, the decades that followed were the autopsy conducted with crowbars. Witley Court, abandoned and unprotected, became a quarry. Anyone with a truck and a lack of scruples could drive up and take what they wanted. Marble chimney pieces were ripped from walls. Lead was torn from the surviving sections of roof. Stone balustrades were carted away. The orangery, already damaged, was stripped of its remaining glass and ironwork. Carved stonework was levered from facades and sold to dealers. The house was disassembled by informal consensus, its components scattered across the antiques trade and the salvage yards. Some of the removals were more ambitious. Billy Butlin, the holiday camp entrepreneur, he reportedly tried to buy the Perseus fountain and ship it to his resort at Skegness. The plan fell through, defeated by the sheer weight and complexity of moving 20 tons of stone and bronze. Bing Crosby was rumored to have inquired about shipping it to America. That too came to nothing. What'd leave the country were the ornamental entrance gates. Designed for the wards, wrought in iron, they were eventually sold and shipped to a resort in Arizona. The gates that had welcomed the Prince of Wales to shooting weekends in Worcestershire ended up welcoming tourists to the American desert. It would be hard to invent a more precise image of cultural dispersal. Through the 1940s and 50s, the ruin sat in its landscape like a broken tooth. Local children played in the roofless rooms. By vegetation crept through the shattered floors. Trees grew inside the house, their roots finding the rubble, their branches reaching toward the open sky where ceilings had been. Then, in 1967, something unexpected happened. A rock band arrived. Procol Harum, riding the success of their single A Whiter Shade of Pale, filmed a promotional clip at Witley Court. The footage is haunting. Band members wander through the ruins in the diffused light of a gray English afternoon. Arches frame empty sky. Walls stand with nothing behind them. The music, with its Bach-influenced organ line and surreal lyrics, matched the setting with eerie precision. It captured the absolute nadir of Witley Court's existence, a place so ruined that its only remaining function was as a backdrop for a pop song about confusion and loss. The ironwork, the marble, the lead, the gates, the glass. For 40 years, Witley Court was a corpse being stripped of its jewelry. What the fire had not taken, the scrap dealers did. What the dealers missed, the weather finished. By the late 1960s, the ruin was approaching the point of no return. But the ruin, it turned out, was harder to kill than the palace had been. Chapter 11. The Ruin That Refused to Disappear. It took the British government until 1972 to decide that what was left of Witley Court was worth saving. The rescue came late and arrived in stages. A building preservation order was placed on the ruin in 1964, preventing any further deliberate demolition. But a preservation order on a roofless building is like a bandage on a severed limb. It stops some bleeding. It does not restore function. The real intervention came in 1972 when the government issued a compulsory guardianship order. The ruin was taken into state care. The Department of the Environment, and later English Heritage, assumed responsibility for stabilizing what remained. The work was painstaking. Walls were consolidated. Unsafe sections were dismantled and rebuilt. The south facade, with its bath stone cladding and Nash's colossal portico, was stabilized and conserved. The Church of St. Michael, which had survived the fire untouched, was maintained as a functioning place of worship. Its Baroque ceiling, bought from a duke's demolished chapel 2 centuries earlier, continued to glow above empty pews. English Heritage took over management in 1984 and began a more comprehensive program of conservation and interpretation. The grounds were cleared and the garden layout restored. Archaeological work uncovered the original paths, planting beds, and water systems. The skeleton of Nesfield's parterre design was made legible again. The most dramatic restoration was the fountain. In 2002, the Perseus and Andromeda fountain was restored to working order. After decades of silence, water once again rose from the bronze figures and fell in cascades across the Portland stone basin. The fountain now operates on selected days for visitors, a ghost of its former self, but still powerful enough to provoke a sense of scale and wonder. In 2003, the freehold of the Witley Court estate was sold on eBay for £975,000. The number is worth pausing over. The trustees had paid £680,000 for the estate in 1837. Adjusted for inflation, that sum would exceed $100 million today. 166 years later, the ruin and its grounds sold on an internet auction site for less than the price of a London flat. In 2023, English Heritage launched Witley Court Reimagined, a digital initiative using projection and augmented reality to show visitors what the house looked like at its peak. Visitors could stand in the roofless ballroom and see, through their phone screens, the chandeliers, the gilded ceiling, the silk walls. The technology made the absence more vivid. It showed exactly what had been lost. But something at Witley Court has refused to die entirely. On the surviving wall of the orangery, where the glass and iron structure once soared, a camellia plant still grows. It was planted during the Ward era, over a century ago. The fire did not kill it. The frost did not kill it. The neglect did not kill it. It flowers each spring against the blackened stone, the only living thing at Witley Court that remembers what the house was. Chapter 12. What the walls remember when the roof is gone. Strip away the plaster, the gilt, the silk, and the bathstone, and Witley Court finally tells the truth about itself. Walk the ruins today, and you will see something that no visitor during the golden years ever saw. Where the bathstone facade has fallen away, the original Jacobean brickwork shows through. Red, rough, 400 years old. The bricks that the Russells laid in the 1620s, that the Foleys bought in the 1650s, that the Wards covered in the 1850s, are visible again. Each layer of the house's history is exposed at once. You can read the building like a geological core sample, each stratum representing a different fortune, a different ambition, a different attempt to make wealth look permanent. The Jacobean brick says, someone built a modest house here and thought it would last. The Nash portico says, someone covered that house with grandeur and thought grandeur would last. The bathstone says, someone covered the grandeur with even greater grandeur and thought money itself would last. The charred timbers say, none of it did. This is what makes Witley Court more valuable as a ruin than it ever was as a palace. When the house functioned, it told a lie. It said, this is permanent. This wealth, this power, this way of life will endure. Every room, every fountain, every replanted flower bed existed to sustain that fiction. The 100 servants moving invisibly through hidden corridors. the 30 tons of coal burned daily to heat rooms that were used once a year. The gardens redesigned between dinner courses. All of it was a performance of permanence. The ruin tells the truth. Fortunes rise and fall. Industries boom and contract. Systems that seem eternal. Colonial slavery, industrial monopoly, the servant economy, aristocratic display, all have expiration dates. The people who built Witley Court did not know this, or if they knew, and they did not want to believe it. Walk past the Perseus fountain on one of the days it operates, and you can still feel a shadow of the original spectacle. Water rising from bronze, light catching the spray. For a moment, the illusion holds. Then the pump cycles down, the water falls, and you are standing in front of 20 tons of stone in a garden that nobody maintains for the pleasure of a prince. The church still stands, just yards from the house. Inside, Bellucci's ceiling paintings glow in the same amber light they have known for nearly 3 centuries. The glass windows still filter the Worcestershire sun. The church survived because it was built to serve a community, not to impress one. The house was built to impress. An impression, unlike community, does not outlive its audience. 665 people were enslaved in Jamaica to help fund what you see here. 1 million tons of coal were dug from the earth each year. 100 servants lived invisible lives so that 300 guests could dance without seeing a maid carry coal. The fire pump rusted because no one cared enough to test it. The insurance covered a quarter of the damage. The freehold sold on eBay. These are not separate facts. They are the same story. Witley Court was built by a system that extracted wealth from labor, from colonies, from the earth, and converted it into stone and spectacle. When the system contracted, the spectacle collapsed. The fire did not destroy the house. The fire simply arrived after everything else had already left. Stand in the roofless ballroom. Look up. There is no ceiling. There are no chandeliers. There is only the Worcestershire sky, gray or blue depending on the day. The birds nest in the walls where silk once hung. Rain falls where dancers once turned. And the Jacobean bricks, the oldest thing here, the thing that every generation tried to hide, are finally the only thing left to see. Great fortunes do not build permanent things. They build temporary spectacles of permanence. And sometimes the spectacle is more honest once the performance is over.